Okay, we're back with Professor Abramelech, and we are on Exodus 10 to 11, Plague of the Firstborn.
By the time we have got to the Plague of the Firstborn, the damage in Egypt has already been done. Egypt has been wiped out. The cattle has been destroyed. The river has overflowed. The creatures have gone loose. And every level of Egyptian society is in chaos. And so this last plague is in fact not really a last plague. It has been happening. The firstborn animals have already been killed. Children and adults have died, and so the defining or the observation of a plague specifically to the firstborn seems to be one of commentary, seems to be one of editing, for the purpose of pedagogy, of teaching a lesson, but in fact all the damage has been done. This has just been identified as a specific plague around which a story is going to be told, and the story is that that Moses has become a very important person in Egypt. He already was in line to the succession, and now he forewarned the Egyptians that there are going to be storms and there's going to be hail and darkness, and he even told them that they should protect their cattle, and he possibly could be seen or interpreted to have been trying to help or to assist the Egyptian people, but the Pharaoh was not listening. So indeed there may have been a revolution, and Moses is really determined in a almost Levitical cunning to completely rob the Egyptians of their wealth, and to use that as compensation to establish that the fraud and the enslavement of the people would not be rewarded, but the opposite, compensation would be paid. And he was determined that he was going to demonstrate that in unique ways, not only through the signs, not only through the language that he was going to do, but through the exercise of exchanges. He was going to extort almost the Egyptian people, that they would beg the Israelites to leave or to satisfy the will of that demanding God that was causing them punishment. So, speak now in the ears of the people, and let them ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor jewels of silver and jewels of gold. See, Moses said, you're going to come out very rich, and now he is showing that that there is the integrity from the beginning of the plan until the end of the plan. And it is very important, that integrity, because actually the name of God, it very much relates to the idea of saying and then doing, of making a promise and fulfilling. Just as God fulfilled the promises to Abraham, made promises to Abraham, and then fulfilled them. He made the promises that they're going to be slaves in Egypt, but then they were going to be redeemed. The ability to extend one's self and one's presence over a period of time or over a process is the divine process. The ability to call something by a name and to make reference to it throughout its different compositions is the divine process. And here we're seeing that the story, that the promise that Israel is going to be compensated for their slavery, and that the Egyptians would actually give them of their treasures, of their gold and of their silver, is almost a fulfillment even of the blessing in Genesis, that in your seed, your seed will be blessed, and you will inherit the gates of your enemies. In this case, they're not inheriting the gates of the enemies. The enemy is giving all of its jewelry and its value for them eventually just to leave. So we see a development of the situation where, and this is also explained in the text, that in fact the Pharaoh does not want them to go until a situation where the Pharaoh lets them go but tries to stop some of them from going, until the extent that he forces them out. And the term is used, you force them like a divorcee, that you just are wanting to push them out. So that entire evolution is going to be described as if it was already constructed, that a Pharaoh would be manipulated and his heart would be clear. As hard as it was very clear to predict its trajectory. And they were preparing for the great Exodus, and they knew that very, very soon they would be going, and they would borrow the instruments of the gold and the silver and the bowls of the neighbors. To borrow, can we borrow them? We will give them back to you when we come back. That was the pretext, but in fact it was going to be a great heist in broad daylight. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of the Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So Moses was already a great man, and he was about to demonstrate a drama that would be remembered. And the drama was pitted against the very story of creation, where it was known that God separated the night from the day and separated the spheres. This would take place in midnight, where there is a complete mix. This would be the opposite to creation, and all the firstborn of Egypt would die. And this would be the very opposite to the biblical story of thou shalt be fruitful and multiply. And even the firstborn of the meal and the firstborn of the cattle would die, and this would be in contradistinction to the biblical, the command in the book of Genesis that one should dominate and should rule over and organize and order the animals. That in fact the dystopia would be that the ability for us to organize our agricultural processes would be completely destroyed, where the firstborn and the first cattle and the sheaves of the first fruit, which are usually gifts and expressions of happiness and bounty and celebration. These very gifts of nature are going to be destroyed, that the firstborn of Egypt would be wiped out. The firstborn of the Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even to the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. This is a universal idea. So it seems very clear that this is not a historical subject, but a subject that one should take very dearly into one's heart at every generation, that this refers to everyone, that the potential for the gifts of nature, the harvest, the bounty could be turned into the harvesting of bitter fruits, and that is dependent on an attitude that we take every day. Hot in anger against all the wonders that were multiplied in the land of Egypt, God made Pharaoh's heart hard in order to teach a lesson to Israel. And here would be the lesson, would be the reconstruction of the heart, the reconstruction of an ethic, the reconstruction of a society. And straight after this story of the Exodus and this story of destruction, Moses begins to reconstruct, and he begins the entire reconstruction of the ideal state, the utopia, the republic, with the concept of the first fruit. That in it, the very destruction of the firstborn of Egypt would be corrected yet again, a countermeasure, that all the first fruit of the nation, the enlightened nation, will be given to the Levites and to the priests and to the stranger, and will be given for charity, and will be given to support a centralized authority which would service and instruct and help and teach the nation. So here, in this sense of destruction and loss of Egypt, were the buds of an ideal that would flourish in what is later called the laws of Moses. What really did Moses do? He came into a situation where there were a natural crisis happening from the plagues, from the bubonic plague, to hail and ice and possibly volcano eruptions. And what he essentially did was interpret. He interpreted the circumstances of the time to an agenda that he had, a freedom agenda that he had for his people. Possibly, one could say, and as I've been arguing, that he actually played a role in executing it. Another possibility was that he simply contextualized it into a freedom narrative for his people, because we see that not one bullet was shot, that there was no war here, that there was no revolution, that there was no fighting in the streets, that there was no open enmity, that there was no sword fighting, that there were no spears, that even the death of the firstborn was not a plague in its own right. It could not have been, because people were dying throughout the whole epidemic, and at every stage of it. So the death of the firstborn seemed to represent a phenomenon which occurred over the entire period of the plagues. Moses is in many ways the same as Joseph, and that Joseph also recognized the situation that he observed in the famine of Egypt, and he was able to deliver the results, to synthesize a solution to the problems for Egypt. So it was a matter of interpretation of a situation that both Joseph did, and was rewarded with the favors of the Pharaoh, and what Moses did. He understood the undoing of Egypt and chose to articulate and identify and champion a solution. And there was a great cry in the land, and which was never heard before it, from the beginning of Egypt until its end. And it says here, the children of Israel were like a dog not licking its bottom. Actually, the question of the dog needs clarification. A dog is a remarkable instrument in biblical thought. The very name dog, kelev, like the heart of a person, almost suggests the temperament of a person and the relationship that people have towards their dogs, or what they think towards other dogs, is often a measure of temperament. And here the role of the dog is being discussed. One of the important commentators suggests that the dogs did not bark as the children of Israel left Egypt, which would suggest either that the divine was controlling even the wildest of dogs, but it could also suggest that there was already the domestication of animals, including the dog, which was one of a first and important domesticated animal, which was trained not to bark and was trained to hunt, and like the mastery established the mastery of all the animals and the creatures. The mastery over the dog was one of them, and there is possibly another interpretation that the dog would not lick its bottom, or that there would not be the subordination of a people towards another people, that there would be independence. It may be an old analogy, this term, and it is used interestingly in the context. And here an interesting event occurs. We see that Moses is again in front of the Pharaoh, and they are arguing, and in the end Moses leaves from the Pharaoh in anger, where his nostrils are flared. But we have just read before that Pharaoh threatened Moses that if he comes again, he will not leave alive. Here, it's being demonstrated that the threats of Pharaoh are empty. That in fact, Moses comes to the Pharaoh and he leaves not only alive, but he leaves angry with the Pharaoh. Now, what are we seeing here? In fact, possibly the true face of the dialogue, that Moses is trying to convince the Pharaoh, possibly as a favor to Egypt, not to bring Egypt to a situation of despotism. That in fact, he was representing not only a minority, but he was representing a large part of the Egyptian population. And we see from the historical record that Egypt had a lot of minorities and was occupied also by Canaanites, but also Sudanese and Africans, and it was a mixed group of people, and that Moses was in fact representing a great voice, not the voice of a small minority, but rather he was a great man in the land of Egypt and was representing the majority, and did not want to see the failure of Egypt. And when he left Pharaoh in anger, he left Pharaoh because he wanted Pharaoh to change his heart. He did not want terrible things to happen to Egypt, and was trying to convince and persuade possibly a relative or a young underling of Moses to change his ways. Alas, the heart of the Pharaoh would be hardened as per the promise of the Tetragrammaton, and this would be to tell a story for generations. It seems that the choice of this pharaoh, of all the dynasties of pharaohs, was because this pharaoh was rotten to the core, and he had brought a situation of great plenty and surplus of Egypt into a situation of destruction. And he had all the advice and the opportunity and demonstrated, and therefore it was a stage to play the destruction of a human, isolated and sad, and it was the stage that Moses was going to demonstrate the power of the word and the power of the law and the power of justice, and it was all being carried out on the stage of the pages of these words. The Pharaoh had an option, and the option was to repent, and he was not able to do so. And the great tragedy is that it had been predicted in advance, and there was nothing to do about it. And the great hope, which is expressed by the commentators, is that the daughter of Pharaoh lived on, and she was a righteous woman, and she was the lady that had adopted Moses, and her offspring too became part and parcel of the nation of Israel. And there is a further story of Pharaoh escaping after the destruction of his armies in the sea, and then redeeming himself, converting, repenting after all this. And his figure is described in the book of Job as the man that has so much, that suffers so much, that returns to the right way. And so there is an underlying optimism of the what could be possibilities of humanity were they to internalize the directions and the signs and the notices and everything that we should notice and take heed to them and internalize them, and that our hearts should not be hardened, the antithesis to the 10 plagues.